Bonjour à tous, c'est Portinou, bienvenue pour cette nouvelle vidéo sur la SDA TV. J'ai l'honneur et la chance aujourd'hui d'avoir un invité pour cette vidéo. Il s'agit de Seastan, que beaucoup d'entre vous connaissent probablement déjà, mais que nous allons présenter plus en détail. On va faire une interview aujourd'hui en anglais, puisque Seastan est américain, mais rassurez-vous, vous aurez les sous-titres dans la vidéo à partir du moment où nous allons commencer la discussion, donc ne vous enfuyez pas si la discussion est en anglais. Hi, Seastan.
Hi. One small correction. I'm not American. I'm actually
Not a...
Canadian, and
Oh,
I'm a little
sorry, that was maybe an insult.
I'm a little embarrassed to admit it though because you might expect me to have some level of French speaking ability, um, having grown up in a dual language country, but I'm afraid I haven't really retained much that I learned in school.
You know, I'm Belgian and we are supposed to be a bilingual country too. But I have to
Yeah.
say that most French-speaking people in Belgium do not speak Dutch, which is the other language of the country. So I guess at least a part of the viewers is going to, to understand. So Sistan, may I ask you first to introduce yourself for the ones who don't know who you are, basically in the Lord of the Rings community.
Yeah, so um, I've been around the community for a while. I started playing the game when it was originally released, um, mostly just by myself or with some friends. And then many years ago, um, I became more involved in the community, started making YouTube videos. I joined the Cardboard of the Rings podcast as a co-host. Um, then I then I sort of took over the maintenance of the Octagon plugin and then RingsDB. Um, and then I started um, so then I started working on ALEP, which is this extension to the game after FFG has stopped developing new content for it. So I started that and have been doing that since I think 2019 or so. And then I developed dragon cards um, and have just recently put out Dragon Cards 2.0, which if you play other games than Lord of the Rings, you might be interested in, and maybe we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
So yeah, not much.
Pretty busy indeed. So I think I'm not exaggerating if I say that you are pretty much the most important person in the Lord of the Rings community. I think most people know you, even if people are not aware that you are behind ALEP or you are behind Dragon Cards. Even if you go to RingsDB and look at the Hall of Fame of the most popular decks, I think yours are pretty much you have 3, 4, 5 decks in the top 10 of most popular decks anyway. So even that way, I guess people have already seen your name one way or another.
Yeah,
And so
thank you.
the question I have for you is, what motivates you to be so active in the community?
Well, I guess I just have um, a passion for a few different things, and they all combine in this game. So, um, growing up, I have been a big fan of the of Tolkien's universe ever since I was a kid. I was introduced to the. I was actually first introduced to the universe, I think, through a board game, which was the Reiner Knizia cooperative Lord of the Rings board game. I'm not sure if you've ever played that one.
Interesting. Never.
Um,
I've never heard of it. So
yeah, I mean, I recommend it. If you like co-op Lord of the Rings games, which I think most of the audience here does, um, I recommend that one. And it came out before the movies. And so that was my first exposure to it. My family's always been into board games and as a result, I also became into board games and card games. Um, I played a lot of Pokemon growing up, and then I saw the movies, became a huge Lord of the Rings fan, read the books, Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, like just everything I could get my hands on. And then kind of since then, anytime there's been a interaction between the gaming world and the Lord of the Rings world, I've been there. So, like any Lord of the Rings game, I've pretty much played. Um, and that's sort of, and then this game came out, Lord of the Rings cooperative card game that I could play by myself. It was like the perfect, um, the perfect combination to get me to grab onto it. And so, um, yeah, I've been playing ever since.
Yeah. And so you playing since basically 2011 from the very beginning of the game, if I understand
Yes.
correctly.
Yep.
Very
From the very
nice.
beginning.
Yeah,
Hmm.
very nice. And so the question I have for you is how much time do you spend on all the activities that revolve around the Lord of the Rings card game? Because for such a busy person, I guess it's almost a second job, if should I say, even if you don't get money for it. So how do you organize your time to be so active, and how much time do you spend on these activities?
Yeah. Maybe more than I care to admit, but it really varies a lot based on what's going on at the time. So if I'm like, for example, working on this Dragon Cards 2.0, um, I, in the lead up to that, I was working maybe an hour or two every day on that in the evenings, like after the kids go to bed. Um, and during those times, I tend to work less on my other community involvement projects like ALEP. But if I'm, say, designing an ALEP quest and we're releasing it soon, then like it totally switches, and I spend those hour or two a day working on that. Um, but yeah, it is difficult, and it's getting more difficult as my kids grow in number and age. And so I'm kind of glad that now Dragon Cards 2.0 is out because I don't have to spend much time on that anymore. Um, and now ALEP is growing and has got a lot of people volunteering for different quest designs. So there's a little bit less on my plate in terms of design. I think the only quest that I might design in the next year is going to be the next Gen Con, like Con of the Rings scenario. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's my main hobby. So, I'm not into watching sports or, doing a lot of other things that people spend their time on. So I guess that's how I get it done.
Now, the question I'm wondering now is, do you still have time to actually play the game, or are you mostly busy with the development of the new Dragon Card version of ALEP design, or do you still
Yeah.
play actually scenarios?
I do still play scenarios. In fact, on Cardboard of the Rings, every episode we try to do a quest review where I'll take a different deck, play the same scenario, and talk through what we liked and didn't like about that scenario. And that's I'm really appreciative of that segment that we do because it definitely gets me to the table or the screen to play. Um, and there's some play testing I do for ALEP as well, particularly on the player card side. Um, and um, like this recent pack, which we can talk about, the Blue Wizards. I played a lot of the Blue Wizards. Um, but yeah, we also have a great play testing team, so I can count on feedback from them for improving the designs. And so we can iterate and improve the designs without me having to play each version of the cards, which is nice.
Now, before we go further into the organization and the evolution of ALEP, still about you and your relationship with the game, what do you particularly like with this game? Do you have, for example, favorites in terms of mechanics or characters? What do you like in the game?
Um, so I guess my favorite hero is Iristor, and I
Good choice,
just
very good choice. We're going to be
yeah.
best friends.
I mean, who doesn't love drawing lots of cards? I think it seems like there's basically no downside to it. I don't even consider the fact that you have to discard your hand to be much of a downside. In fact, you can turn it into an upside. So, yeah, I love that hero. And basically, if anyone gives me a deck with him, doesn't matter what else the deck is doing, I'm gonna be having a good time. Um, in terms of scenario, um, or archetypes. So I get for archetypes, I think it would depend if you're including ALEP or not. But if you are not including ALEP, one of my favorite archetypes to play is basically like a very good tail archetype where you're pumping out big allies. It's not really a specific trait, but a lot of different archetypes can do
Mm.
that. Um, yeah, and if you are including ALEP, I would say actually probably this new Blue Wizards archetype is my favorite to play. Um, but it's a hard decision. There's a lot of great cards we put out. In terms of scenario, again, I think it depends. If you are including, if I can selfishly include scenarios that I've designed, um, it would be the Hobbit scenario that I designed last year. And if you're talking strictly FFG quests, I gotta go with my most played quest, which is Escape from Umbar. Is definitely my favorite. I could just play that scenario. You could get rid of all the other ones, and I'd still have a fun time um, testing different decks and um, trying to beat that quest over and over again. So,
This is one of the scenarios I play the most too, I think.
mhm.
One of these where I know I just want to have a fun evening. I'm just gonna play this one because it's going to be a fun time every single time I play it. I've never had a bad experience playing
No.
Escape from Umbar basically. So that's a very good one too, I think. All right. No, speaking of ALEP, you said that you have less and less on your plate nowadays. So the ALEP team has evolved over time. So how did it all started? Because if I'm not mistaken, you didn't start alone. Maybe you can correct me, but you were already a few people busy with the first steps, at least when ALEP was announced at the end of 2020. Um, how did it all started, and what do you see as an evolution now that we are pretty much 4 or 5 years later?
Um, yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's been many years since I announced it, but I recall just being alone at the beginning and putting out a post on my blog calling for help. And this was when FFG essentially announced they were pausing the development of new cycles, which we all understood as basically a permanent pause. Um, and I had, up until that point, I had kind of been doing my own solo design. So I had made a quest, the Siege of Erebor, um, which actually turned out later to be an ALEP quest, but originally was just my design. And I had designed a bunch of player cards. I had a whole spreadsheet going, and I figured, well, if FFG is not developing anymore, this is a good opportunity for me to start this fan effort to continue the game because I've got a back catalog of stuff that I could be starting with. And I know many other communities of retired card games have started the same way and have been successful. So I figured we could try that with our community, see if it could sustain itself. And instantly, I got tons and tons of people signing up, and I just took everyone in. I think that's a little bit. Um, I think from what I've seen, it's a little bit different than the way other card game continuations have taken place. This is a lot more of a community um, effort than it is a team effort. Like we don't we don't have like applications for joining. Um, you just tell us, hey, I want to come play test, and we invite you to the Discord. Um, so I think that helped the ALEP team grow very quickly. We had a lot of people helping in all areas of the development, and we started with the spreadsheet I had, um, on the player card side at least, and then we got some um, good creative writers to come up with a story for the first cycle. We decided on a setting, being in Rohan, and started planning out quests. So that's sort of where it started, and then it took us like 2 years to, I think, or a year and a half, or I can't remember exactly, but it was a while before we actually put out the first deluxe box, and it really opened my eyes to how much is actually involved in game development. I kind of thought I could just design a bunch of cards, play test them a little bit, and then release them. But thankfully, there's a lot of people in our team that have a very high standard for quality that really drive me to continue to revise and uh, get the best possible, for example, best possible card templates and formatting and um, art, and like make sure every pixel is perfect on the card before we release it. And I don't know if I can say we succeeded that. I can't say everything is perfect. Um,
I can give you my quote unquote external feedback on this. I've seen other, let's say, community efforts for retired card games. For example, the Game of Thrones living card game that I've played a bit of. Um,
mhm.
I've never seen such a high standard for a community effort as I do with ALEP. Like, and I've seen also fan-made content, for example, for Marvel Champions or for Arkham Horror card game. For me, the level that ALEP reaches is really completely different than what you see in these other community efforts. Like, I know that it's something that's really important for you, that the cards that are released from ALEP could be cards officially released. Like, it's sort of a continuation of official content that could be done by FFG, and that really gives me this impression for the most part. And now that I've joined the internal effort and I see a little bit more uh, of what's basically happening behind the curtain, I'm really impressed, like you say, by the level of commitment, but also the standard of people working for ALEP. Like, sometimes I'm thinking like this card could be released as is, and we still spend weeks and weeks and weeks play testing it and tweaking it because it's not perfect. And that's, for my opinion, for what it's worth, is really that's we see that with the level of quality of the design.
I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, I think um, it is. Yeah, it is definitely a passion project for everyone involved, and we're not making any money from this. And so everyone is there because they really want to be there and they enjoy the work. And I think that's that's how you get that's how you get a good product.
Yeah. Now, you've said that now you have more people, for example, available for designing scenarios, and you are less busy with these and more busy with the player card design. Um, One thing that I've noticed, and I'm not the only one with the release of the first scenarios of this second cycle of ALEP, is that the scenarios in general are easier than they were in the first cycle. Um, which does not mean they are worst. I like both cycles so far, and I'm not the only one in the French community saying the first cycle of ALEP is pretty much in the three best cycles of the entire game. I know you know Rooks or Camille who has the same opinion, for example, and I'm not talking about a rookie player,
Right.
but the direction of the scenarios has changed. I understand that you are less busy with the design of these scenarios. Is it something that was, um, let's say, purposeful? Like you wanted the scenarios to be easier, to be more appealing for a less experienced audience, or is it more something that happened in the design? I'm not going to say by accident, but that was not the initial intent.
I mean, it's hard to say because you've only seen like we've only released the first three like the deluxe and we've just recently released the first um adventure pack, but we haven't seen the full second cycle yet. So um all we have to go on is the first few scenarios, and I would say I think we did want the difficulty to be a little step lower than our first cycle, at least in terms of the deluxe box. The deluxe box was released kind of before the repackaged content, so it was more like the elite players, the experienced veterans are now moving on to this deluxe box, and the challenge should be relatively geared towards someone with a full card pool and some expert knowledge of the game. Whereas with the second cycle, we definitely have a lot more players in the community now that are coming in with the repackaged content. And just thematically, it made sense that a deluxe, a set of three quests that are taking place in the Shire was not the same intensity as, orcs storming across the plains of Rohan. Um, So it's a bit of a mix of both, and I expect later in the cycle we'll have some harder quests. But yeah, initially the difficulty is a little bit lower.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And the point was to have this second cycle, like you said, in the Shire. One question that was asked by people in the French community is what's coming next. So they are already thinking about cycle three,
Mhm.
cycle four, and more specifically, one question that sometimes comes is it all still going to be about the third age, basically in terms of timeline, or do you plan to explore other ages of the Tolkien lore?
We don't have we would like to do more content after this second cycle. We haven't set we haven't set a specific region or place or time yet. Um, but I don't foresee us doing a whole separate age just because logistically I mean, for example, we have a first age content, fan content from Ian from Tales from the Cards um, that uh, is like there's certain challenges thematically in making that work with the rest of the card pool. Like many of the characters you have, you can't. It doesn't really make sense to play with, um, and you'd kind of be starting over from a essentially a brand new card pool, which doesn't excite me too much as a deck builder. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think we'll probably be continuing with the current timeline. Um, yeah, but again, like I said, we haven't actually made up our minds yet.
Yeah, but that's pretty clear answer. Now let's talk about the player card design. I'd like to discuss a few points with you, and the first one is the way, let's say, the direction was taken with the first cycle of player cards. And something that has been noticed in the French community, and I guess not only in the French community, is that a big part of the design of the first cycle was um, intended to quote unquote fix existing archetypes. And when I say
Mhm.
fix, I'm talking about making them more balanced and I would say solo friendly for the most part. Like let's take the examples of Dunedain, which is known to be a very bad archetype for solo players. Now with the heroes and the cards that were released, like Gilren, now it becomes way easier to play Dunedain in solo. But you also had
Mhm.
that with Eagles, you had that with Bjorning, with Woodman, with Gondor, if I'm not mistaken. So I guess it was intended. Why did
Yeah.
you want to start by fixing, let's say, these archetypes?
I mean, that's it's sort of because that was my feeling at the time that FFG said they were stopping development. It was a bit of, oh, I mean, you mean like my Bjorning deck is never going to be like a reality? I mean we just don't have enough cards to play a thematic Bjorning deck. Um, and there's certain archetypes that I thought, and many of the playtesters in ALEP thought were not at the power level the general community wanted them to be at. Like Rohan, for example, we felt that they, as such a prominent um, trait in the lore, they deserve to be on the level of some of the other top tier archetypes in the game. And um, we started with that in mind of basically designing for ourselves what we wanted to have in this game. And at the time we were just developing for ourselves. We hadn't put anything out yet. And I guess the best way to motivate people to work on a volunteer project is to get them to do stuff that they want to play with. And that turned out to be, I think, uh, a good way to start. Um, and I'm pretty happy with where a lot of these different archetypes are now.
Now, you took the example of Rowan. When I think Rowan, I'm not thinking about a an archetype that was weak before ALEP. I think it was a pretty average archetype. Like Gondor was a pretty average plus archetype, let's say, compared to
Hmm.
Eagles or Bjorning or Dunedain, which were very hard to play in solo. Well, impossible with Bjorning or Eagles if you're
Right.
thematically playing these. Um, when I'm thinking of Rowan, the first card that comes to my mind is Tangle.
Hmm.
Um, and I would say that's a critic side. So I gave the nice words. So now I'm coming to give more of my critical point of view. When I think of Tangle, I'm thinking this card alone is able to basically completely change the Rowan archetype. Like you have Rowan decks with Tangle and you have Rowan decks without Tangle. Like for example in Dwarf decks, you have the decks with Dine
Yeah.
and you have the decks without Dine. Was it something purposeful to create some cards that were very powerful? Because I see in the ALEP design that you have some cards that are very powerful.
Hmm.
Like I gave this example of Tangle, but I could also think of Estelle, which is for the most part now in the discussion of the best card in the game,
Hmm.
at least in the French community. So we have a discussion now between Estelle and Velia as to know which is the best card in the game. And on the other hand, you have cards that are more, let's say, average, that are supposed to create more. I'm not going to say fun thematics because I'm not saying that powerful decks are not fun, but I mean another way to play the game. Um, when you're designing player cards, do you have the intent to create more powerful cards and more, let's say, original cards, or how do you approach this part of the design?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think we could probably talk for a whole hour just on this. Um, I would say there's many different um, factors that contribute. So um, it really depends on the card you're talking about. But there are some cards that we design specifically to be strong. Um, and we're doing that because we either want to give a big boost to a certain archetype. You know, you said Rohan was decent already, but my comment was more about how people felt like it should be a top tier archetype like Noldor or dwarves. Rohan is such a prominent trait that
Oh, I do not
we want.
deny that. I'm pretty
Yeah,
disappointed by Ruan Vanilla, so I'm not contesting that point.
yeah, um, and yeah. So in the case of Thengol, this is actually a card that was in that original spreadsheet I talked about. I had designed it many years before even ALEP started. I was just a really big fan of helping this discard mechanic um, improve by replacing the discarded ally, so that you could feel more free to actually use these effects. Um, and yeah, we play tested this card a bunch, and we felt it was very strong. That's what we wanted. And um, you know, in some cases, there can be slight um, surprises. Like we were pretty much on the cusp of releasing it when, or it had already been through a lot of the design when Letherial was announced by FFG, which obviously boosts him up a bunch. Um, and so that wasn't, you know, quite intended. And so there's sometimes unintended things that happen as well, um, you know, in the power level. So you know, I'm not uh, like I said, I'm not claiming that every card ALEP puts out ends up being perfect. Sometimes the card ends up finding interesting combinations and areas of strength in the general community that we didn't particularly plan for. You know, we have a limited size team and time to get these cards out, and we're balancing things like, oh, people want more content, and at a certain point, you know, you have to call the playtesting done if you want to satisfy the large majority of people that just want to have new cards in their hands. Um, but I think overall, there's nothing too damaging, I would say, to the health of the game that has come out from ALEP, in my opinion, at least. Nothing so strong that has caused me to cause me concern, um, or people, you know, devaluing the game by breaking it with our cards. And for the most part, the strong cards that you see in ALEP were intentional. Um, I think there's only um, one real errata we put out from a like an unintended combo with a card, which escaped playtesting, which was
It's the
the
relic of Nargothrond.
the relic of Nargothrond. Yes, yeah,
Yeah, which was indeed pretty disgusting when we discovered it. The combo
yeah.
was insane. But yes, indeed, I don't think that you have OP cards in the design. I just think some cards are stronger than others, but I don't see any cards damaging, like you say, the game, because nothing is stronger than what already exists in the base game. So the strongest ALEP cards are not stronger than the strongest vanilla cards, like stuff of the Galadrim or Steward of Gondor or Velia, for example. Um,
That was a huge point for me, like from day one, was we do want to boost these other archetypes, so we have a larger variety of good decks to play, but we want to be careful about it, and that in doing so, we're not accidentally giving a boost to the top tier archetypes that already exist. like Villia or Outlands. Um, and so many of the designs are carefully tuned in that way to avoid pushing the frontier, the best decks any further. And one example I can point out with that is Anduril, our the card that got released alongside Neutral Aragorn. We wanted Anduril to be a very strong attachment, um, and we kind of wanted it to be somewhat similar to the boon you get from the saga. But
Yep.
we knew we wanted it to be very strong and to not just go on Aragorn, because most of Aragorn's artifact attachments can go on any hero, which is very interesting. Um, but it was a challenge to design that in a way that didn't make a Villia deck better, because if this thing can just boost all stats and ready exhaust or ready the attached hero, throwing it in a Villia deck is just it's going to make that deck just instantly stronger. That's one of the best cards you could put in that deck. On Elrond, you can imagine how good that is. And so it took a while, but we came up with this requires 4 traits to play to attach to the hero as a way to limit that. It's not easy to put in Avilia anymore because you don't have any heroes with 4 traits as a target. You would need to first get another card out and attach it to Elrond before you could do that. And we thought that was a significant enough hurdle that it wouldn't really boost the Villia deck much. And it ended up also informing the whole, idea around neutral Aragorn and the idea of gaining traits and him like starting with few traits and growing as a character throughout the course of the game. And it was just nice how the limitations we set for ourselves also inspire some creative impacts on the card design. And so I can say, looking at the way the player card pool is now, I'm still not sure there's any cards that ALEP has put out that would make the top tier Villia like Bond of Friendship deck even more dominant than it is. I look at those deck lists and I struggle to find a way you could swap in an ALEP card to improve it. And so that's yeah, that's the goal essentially. And with the idea being that if this deck exists with the official cards, you can build this dominant deck already. Then if we set that as our um, you know not cross, then we're not going to end up trivializing any official quests or content that can't be already trivialized with official cards.
Yeah, and I think the example you take with Anduril is perfect because for me it's a perfectly balanced card. Like you have constraints to play it. It's it costs 4 resources, which is not cheap, to give you this strong effect. So basically, you're not going to include it in any deck. Even if I've seen it in different decks with different heroes, like the twins, for example, the twins
Mm.
Eladan Elroyer. I've seen that on Glorfindel, for example, but I don't see that on a lot of heroes, and you still have to pay these 4 resources. So you're going to think before including it in a deck. Um, Personally, I've been surprised. I'd like your opinion on this. I've been surprised by 2 cards that were released by ALEP. The first one was Aragorn with Estelle. Because the first time I saw Aragorn, and the first time I played him, I was thinking this is incredibly fun. Like this mechanic with the titles, this is still one of my favorite heroes in the entire game.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
and I was thinking this is so fun to try to use LSR to ready your allies and try to have many traits so that you can ready different types of allies. So you want to get a way to play your different titles. And I played the Grey Wanderer deck, trying to find a way to play these titles, even if they are unique. And this is still one of my favorite decks. in a pretty strong one. But then I saw something that I was not happy with, which is I saw a lot of decks with Aragorn and Estelle chosen as the starting title by people. Like this is, I would say, 95% of the time the title that people choose as a starting title for Aragorn, because it's so powerful that you can choose one card out of three every turn. And I have to say, now I'm already a little bit pissed to see all these decks touching my fan favorite Aragorn hero. So I'm a little bit surprised, and that's the reason why no Estelle is in the discussion of is it the
Yeah.
best card in the game, because you can have it turn one. And the other one
Okay.
I
Well,
was
we
really
can
surprised
talk
by.
about
You can already talk about this one.
We
Okay. Yeah.
about Estel first. Um, Estel, I think gained in strength when exposed to the community. But to me, I'm not entirely disappointed or upset with the strength that it is found. I think it would have been nice if more of these titles were um, balanced in a way that you saw a wider variety of Aragorn starting attachments. Um, but at the same time, there was a bit of a thematic consideration when I was designing that set of cards that maybe Estel would be your first attachment because it is the first title that Aragorn gains. Estel, of course,
Interesting.
means hope. And Gillian says about Aragorn that she gives hope to the Dunedain and she keeps no hope for herself. So that is the first real title that he gains as a child, and is called that in Rivendell. So I think, um, yeah, I think it's very appropriate that he often starts with that, and in a way, the design of it as well is intentional. That it helps you find the other title attachments to put on him. So he first starts as Estil, and he is using that to gain more titles and recognition and attachments, and eventually gains Andoril. And so as you're playing that, I think it's probably the most thematic way to play, rather than to have turn one, he starts as LSR. But that's also fine too. I think we didn't want to pressure anyone to play in a particular thematic way that I had in mind. So, um, I maybe the balance would have been maybe not 95%, but I'm not disappointed that it's the most common attachment chosen.
No, and I have to say, now in the discussion of the best hero in the game, you have the usual suspects like Elrond or Galadriel, but
Yeah,
now you also have Aragorn, and I have to say I'm
that's
fine with
interesting. I
that.
mean,
I'm fine with it because we're talking about Aragorn, right? So it should be in
right.
the discussion of who's the best hero in the game. So thematically, I'd rather have a very strong
Yeah.
Aragorn than a very strong Gollum, for example.
And I'm on record on the Cardboard of the Rings podcast as being a little disappointed in the final Aragorn we got in the official card pool, Spirit Aragorn, because it was so long for him to come out, and we were all
It's
really
incredibly
anticipating
weak. Yeah.
him, and I can see how he's a fun design, and people can like him, but it was just like what I was expecting. And that's fine. But now I get to design one, and I'm going to design one where this neutral Aragorn is like the sum of all the other Aragorns, and you can really play through his entire arc as a character in one game, which I really love. And yeah, he's very strong. He's Aragorn. He should be. But also, I think it's just interesting you say in the French community he's talked about in this way. It's not so much in the English community, um, but
You
I
know how
don't necessarily,
French people are, don't you?
yeah,
They
I
like to
don't,
discuss a lot about power creeping and so.
yeah, yeah. We can talk about power creep in a second, but um, I, I think when you say with Estel he can become possibly a contender for the top hero in the game, I think it takes a lot of skill for him and deck building um, ability to get him to that level. And so I wouldn't directly compare him with a hero like Elrond or Dain, um, where you can pretty much, anyone can throw together these cards and it becomes a top tier deck. And so it's not, I'm kind of glad that you have found a way to get Aragorn to that level through some creative deck building. And it wasn't just, well, we're just going to throw all these Dunedain cards together and he becomes this crazy hero. So I think, yeah, but maybe that's why it's not seen so much in the English community because it is harder to get him to perform
Mm.
in that level. Yeah.
Very interesting. The other card I was a little bit surprised by is the Rider game. Um,
Mm.
when I saw the card first, I saw all the possibilities in terms of deck building. So for example, I very quickly created a deck with the Ring of Thor because I was thinking this is incredibly fun. I'm gonna put that on Dane, and then with Gandalf, I'm gonna see what's the top card of my deck. And with Dane, I can discard cards until I have an attachment I'm interested in, and I can put it into play with Ring of Thor, and I can start the game like that. Very original, very fun. And I started create a few decks like that. But then something I see now a few months later is a lot of decks being created with people saying, okay, I have no contract yet for my deck, so I'm just going to add Rydell Game and Stone of Philosterian because that's the best attachment to begin with. Uh, and so basically, that's become the go-to solution when you don't have a contract for your deck. How do you feel about this, let's say,
Yeah.
evolution of the card?
Well, we definitely did test the riddle game with the Stone of Elestirion, and we did recognize that this was probably the best card to combine with the riddle game because it somewhat neutralizes the drawback of the riddle game, which is having to discard a card every turn for the riddle game. And so you're getting the 2 willpower boost, and you're kind of just drawing and discarding a card. Um, and that was we did know about that, and um, there was there was 2 elements, I guess, that made us release it in the state it is in, which is um, I did play decks in this way and ended up losing my hero on the 3rd turn. um, and so there's this uh, yeah, there's this tempting ability to include it because you can, and there's no real deck building constraints to it. Just like it was, tempting for Bilbo to pick up the ring and not just give it to Gollum when he realized it was Gollum's. And it can come back to bite you, and you can lose. And I've played games, multiplayer games, where one person playing Riddle game, threw it in their deck with the Stone of Elestirion, and then they died on the 3rd or 4th turn, and we ended up the whole party losing. So there's um, the yeah, that's kind of the thematic experience that we wanted to provide with the card. And if you never end up losing with the riddle game, could maybe think that this seems like a little bit of an overpowered combo. But I would question your shuffling skills because, um, yeah, I mean you have to get 3 out of 5 correct. And if you haven't built your deck in such a way, then you often really hurt your chances of successfully completing the riddle game. Um, yeah, so the second thing is that we did feel that the riddle game had some subtle deck building requirements to it that weren't maybe necessarily first at first obvious when you read the card. But for example, 1/3 of an encounter deck is going to be treacheries, which are going to be 0 threat
Mhm.
cost. And if you don't have a lot of 0 cost cards in your deck, it's going to be very hard to win those riddle games, even with an extra card draw from Stone of Illusterian. And the third point was, I guess I said there were 2 points. There's three. Um, it was a really fun design, like you said, with Ring of Thor. There's a lot of interesting things you can do, or getting out an early Orc Wrist to help with maybe a tactics deck that is short on resources, or a Mithril Coat on a deck that likes to take direct damage. So we felt there were a lot of interesting uses for this card that, despite the Stone of Elysterion being a higher power than we maybe would have liked, we felt that on balance, the creative opportunities that existed with other possible options make it an okay card to release. Again, provided we did test Stone of Elysterion and didn't find it too crazy,
Mhm.
then altogether we decided that we would be okay releasing this. That's not to say that we felt, we didn't feel that Stone of Elysterion was this overpowered broken combo, and we said, let's release it anyway because of these other fun things. That's not what I'm saying. But there's a certain level at which you maybe put out a card that has some strong combos and other more interesting combos, and you are kind of satisfying two groups of people: one that wants to play with a strong card, and another that wants to play with an interesting combo.
And so I have to say that's the overall experience I have with the stronger ALEP cards. So we took the example of Estelle or the example of Riddle game. What I see for the most part is that people use the power of these cards to create fun, let's say suboptimal decks. Should I say so? For example, using Estelle because it's going to help me to find the pieces of a very complex deck, but I'm not going to use Estelle to power creep. I'm going to use it because I want to create some fun combo, but I need to find the cards in one way or another. So I'm going to use Aragorn for that as an enabler of my deck. I've been very critical the first time I saw Last Aliens, for example, because I thought it can create some really crazy combos, and it's going to be very difficult on the longer term to be sure that you don't create crazy interactions with the traits. Um, but I have to say, what I see now, and I've created some power creep decks with it, assembling the Outlands and the Dwarfs, for example. But what I see in the community is not this. What I see is this card is used to create fun combos between traits that should not work together or to create fun effects. And that's basically how I see most people use them. I don't think people are like to
Right.
create power creep decks anymore because once you have your too powerful deck, you're done with it, right? But these cards allow for some fun interactions.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, depends on, again, how you exactly define power creep. So I kind of define it as, is the best deck getting better, rather than like, is the average deck getting better? Because I think the average deck getting better is healthy for the game because you've got more creative opportunities to play more difficult quests. Whereas the top deck getting better is generally, in my mind, when I think of like a competitive game, um, where you've got this meta where you've got all the best decks, right? And then a new pack gets released, and the decks you can make with those beat all the decks that existently current in the meta, and so you have to go out, you have to buy all the new cards, and there's this negative experience with power creep because it costs money when you're in this competitive game. Power creep, every cycle you have to keep buying and buying because you need to stay competitive. You need to beat the previous decks because the decks keep getting stronger. Um, Whereas if the frontier, the best decks never improved, then a new pack could come out and you wouldn't need to buy anything. You could still be perfectly competitive with your current best deck. And so even if the new pack improved the worst decks and made them more competitive, you still wouldn't need to go out and buy new cards. You could still continue to use your top tier deck to stay competitive. And so we're trying to avoid power creep by that definition. We don't want the best decks. We don't want the best decks to get better, and then we have to go and design a quest that's even harder because now the decks are stronger, and then now we've got to create even stronger player cards so that you can have a better chance of beating that quest, and then we don't want to keep having this incremental increase in the player card and the encounter card side. So we're kind of building sideways with new interesting archetypes that are, or boosting existing archetypes that are strong, but not trying to, our intention at least is not to increase the top level. And so yeah, I mean, with certain cards, um, maybe we fail at that, and sometimes we will make mistakes. But from what I see of decks that are published, I don't see a lot of people really pushing on that frontier. And yeah, like you said, they're building just more interesting stuff. And I think that's part of the community itself being sort of self-policing, because even if you're talking, just forget about ALEP, you're just talking about the official cards only. You mean you can do insane broken like
Yep.
combo decks. I think I have a fellowship I have on Rings DB that it's two decks together, but they can one deck can basically generate infinite number of cards and resources for the other deck, and basically get that other deck to draw 1,000 cards and play every card on turn one and just blow away the scenario. So that's all official content only, and there's no errata that has come out that has impacted this deck in any way. And yet people aren't using that. So there's some level of, I think you need to be self-policing in this game if you enjoy this game and you're having fun with this game, you must have some ability to control yourself from using decks like that. And so I would actually argue in ALEP, we are even better balanced because we have this optional free to choose list where we can limit those infinite, endless combos that exist in the official card pool. And so if you're actually comparing the top tier deck in FFG versus the best deck you can make with including the free to choose list rules, but definitely no contest, the FFG decks are stronger.
Yep. Agreed. Agreed. So that's indeed something that people have to keep in mind, which is the ALEP design is most of the time done taking this free to choose list into consideration. Like we consider that you want a more balanced experience, so we are let's say creating erratas for the vanilla card so that you have a more balanced experience. And if you want to get something that basically breaks all barriers, you can already, like you said, and nobody has fun like that. I have the same kinds of deck that you are mentioning. I never play these because
Hmm.
it's not fun. So we're not in a
Yeah.
competitive environment, so we just don't care about just demolishing the game for no reason. Um, Speaking of design, one thing we did not mention yet is the creation of completely new archetypes. And the first one I have in mind is the Brie archetype that was introduced in the first cycle. Um, so basically, this idea of you are going to take undefended attacks and you are going to be rewarded for that. That was the first time I saw something completely new. But the first cycle of ALEP was more focused on fixing the existing archetypes. Now that the second cycle is started, we see this idea of expanding new archetypes more, like the minstrels and instruments, for example, in the deluxe box. And now we see that with the Easterlings and the Blue Wizards. And I cannot talk about what's coming next.
Sure.
But basically, we see a shift in the overall orientation. Now, maybe a question that people might have is it a direction that it's going to go further in the future? Are we going to continue creating new archetypes? Or are we going to create more cards for these archetypes that we introduced? Or more, let's say, generalist cards? What's the orientation for the
Yeah.
future?
I mean, if you want, you can even include the pre type of our first cycle as um, a completion of an existing archetype, because we did have one ally, the Barlinman Butterbur ally with the Brie trait listing in the FFG pool, and so we kind of grew that. We took that mechanic that's on the that ally, which was, I think, if I recall, if a Hobbit if a Hobbit hero takes undefended damage, you can assign it to the Barlinman Butterbur ally or something
Yeah,
like
if
that.
all your heroes are obits, I think.
Yeah, okay. So we took that idea, we ran with it, and created a whole archetype out of that. And um, that was really cool. That was really fun, and was, I think, one of our most well-received packs of the player cards in the first cycle, because um, it was something totally new that people didn't have any attachment to. So we weren't, you know, making their Noldor deck. We weren't changing it, um, and making people feel like they had to add new cards. It's just a totally new archetype around a new mechanic. And we did the same with um, the uh, the minstrels in this second deluxe box, building around instruments and songs. Um, and now with the Easterlings, I could say is more of like definitely from made from whole cloth. Like we didn't really take any inspiration from any existing archetypes or cards. We just totally made a brand new archetype. And like I said earlier, I think it's one of my favorite archetypes to play. So um, there's a lot more room for creativity when you're designing out of a set mechanic, and that can lead to some really fun ideas. And we might be pursuing that for many of the later packs in this cycle. Um, I won't say which ones we're gonna do, but um, yeah, I would expect at least one more totally totally new trait that doesn't really have any existing mechanic for.
Yeah, yeah, we can confidently say at least one, I think.
Yeah.
Um, Now, for a question I might have is how do you come with these new archetype IDs? So you mentioned the idea of Barleyman, that was an existing card, but now the Minstrels is something totally new. And I would even argue that you have two Minstrels archetypes. You have the one
Mhm.
with the songs and you have the one with the instruments, which something really interesting because I see decks using them separately. How
Yeah.
do these IDs come basically? What's the starting point?
Yeah. It's really hard to pinpoint because it's such an evolution. So I would kind of have to go through the history of each of these cards, which we do maintain. Um, the heroes go through so many iterations during development. Um, the like these two Astari the two blue wizards we just put out. I don't know. I lost track of the revisions, and they're not just like small revisions. We're just totally like just
Revamping them.
completely
Yeah.
changing what they do. I mean, pretty much the entire time of their existence, they've been, the idea has been, we want these two heroes. We want it to be some kind of two hero deck. But other than that, like it just completely changes and changes and changes, and um, keep changing it until something sticks. Essentially, like with the minstrels as well, they started out totally different. Tom Bombadil went through so many revisions, and we keep changing it. And I mean, the general idea is comes from the theme. Like we just want this hero to interact with songs in some way, and beyond that, we just keep trying different ideas until we find something that's fun to play. And so it's not like one time in the shower I thought, oh, Tom Bombadil should play a song and deal 2 damage or heal 2 damage. It was a
It's a
lot
very
of
iterative process.
changes to different parts of the ability over time, taking one part of the ability that worked, changing something else, trying to refine it down to the the basic elements of um, what this card needs to do, cut away excess text, which sometimes we fail at. Um, but yeah, it starts from the theme and then goes through an iterative design process from there.
No, and something that is I'm really impressed by in the design, and I don't know to what extent it's intended, is all these cards that are created, or almost all these cards, can be used out of their archetypes. So, for example, Tom Bombadil and Goldberry can of course synergize very well, but they can be used completely independently. I've seen decks with Goldberry and Dale cards, like using Goldberry to attach songs to Dale heroes and allies. I've seen decks with Elena that is going to use the instruments to ready or to help the defense of Dunedain. Um, and you took the example of Endril. To what extent do you keep that idea in mind that all these cards should be pretty open in their use and should be usable out of the archetype that we are creating?
I love that question a lot, because it's something that I feel like is sort of maybe more of my signature on some of the designs than um, that maybe you could see a shift somewhat in starting with ALEP, which is every card uh, I want to be able to put in kind of the obvious deck that we are showcasing with the release of this pack. If you're not an experienced deck builder, it'd be fairly easy to understand where a good place this card would go. But it has to have some level of, oh, I could use it in this weird way with this, you know, clearly unintended archetype, and see if that works, and experiment with that. Personally, as a deck builder, first before I became a designer, this is something I would often try to do with many FFG cards, and was disappointed in many ways when either there was a card that was just it's really just designed for this one thing and it's good nowhere else. Like, I don't know, like Great U Bow. Like, you're not gonna put that on anyone other than hard. Um, but the um, I mean, maybe someone will correct me on that, but I haven't seen many great decks with Great U Bow. And it's or cards that just didn't even work in the deck they were intended for, right? So every time I design a card and every time ALEP releases a card, it is very important to me that it has some flexibility in the design to allow for use in other ways. And if it doesn't, I consider that design a failure. And so that's why I love that you notice that, and I like that you have taken that taken those open designs yourself and made some creative decks with those.
Yeah, I basically that's one of the reasons I like the ALEP contests contents the most, because I see all these possibilities that it opens up, and I like this idea of creating new things I was not able to do with the vanilla game. Like you mentioned, for example, the Gondor allies just go in Gondor decks, and these Rohan allies I'm not going to use out of their archetype. No, I see the idea of combining different things to do some crazy stuff, and believe me, you have crazy people in the French community, so I'm not the only one doing that.
Yeah, and part of that was driven by our different release philosophy, where so in FFG design, they would design the whole cycle of player cards. And oftentimes they'd be working on a couple different traits, like say Ents and Sylvan, and then they would mix them up and scatter them throughout all
Mm,
the deluxe and APs. So you get a couple cards here, a couple cards there. And that definitely made sense from a financial standpoint for them to do, so that it would encourage everyone who wants to build a net end deck to buy every pack to get all the end cards. For us, we have no financial incentive whatsoever to get people to print our packs. We get no money from that. So we take the player focused, player centric approach, where we want to try to minimize your cost if you want to just play with the Bjorning. If you just want to make your Bjorning deck work, you can just get this one pack that has all the Bjorning cards in it. And there was a drawback to that, which was people might see us as just like releasing pre-made decks all the time. Um, like, does it get boring to see all these Bjorning cards together that you just throw in a deck and you can play with, and there's not really much deck building you have to do? Whereas at least in FFG's style of release, where you had these cards spread out, say for example the Dunedain cards in the Angmar Awakened cycle, it was a lot of work to try to get the Dunedain mechanic to work. As time went on, every time a new pack came, you got a couple new cards you could put in and maybe improve things here and improve things there. And that was a lot of fun to do. So there was that benefit to their release style. And we wanted to try to get some of that back in our release style by having all these designs a little more open, so that even though we're
yep.
giving you, say, here's a bunch of Gondor cards. Well, maybe there's a way to use each one in some other deck, and you can, if you're an experienced deck builder or you have fun deck building, you can experiment with the cards in that way.
And another thing that I find really interesting in the design is um, it reopens the possibility to use cards I've pretty much never used. Let's take the last example with the Blue Wizards, right? I looked at Alatar thinking, okay, you can exhaust histories to get markers on the quests, on a side quests. It's not terrific. But then I thought, wait a minute, I can do that out of the quest phase. And I started
Hmm.
thinking, there is this tactics very bad side quests where you can discard
Hmm.
engaged enemies. What if I use that in a multiplayer game and everyone takes an enemy and we just discard these enemies? That's something I really like in the design, which is these cards I've never used, now have some utility and are pretty fun to use actually.
Yeah, sometimes that's a happy side effect. Like in that case, it wasn't our intention to revive that card. It just happened that way, and that's always fun to see. There are other times when we are more deliberate with what we try to um, to revive. Um, like for example, Rossiel. We put out a card, um, the Horn of Buckland, I think, and I think it's fairly plainly obvious that we are trying to make her into a better hero with that. Um, and yeah, so. Sometimes, um, sometimes it's a coincidence, sometimes it's not.
Yeah. Now, the last topic I wanted to discuss with you is the use of art on the cards, because a shift that most people have noticed in the second cycle of ALEP is the extensive use of Midjourney, so AI, to create artwork for the cards, which was not the case in the first cycle. Um, so the overall question is, why this shift between the first and the second cycle? Is there any reason for it?
Yes, so that's a good question. And there's a lot I could say about it. Um, but for the first cycle, we were using art that we found online, in the same way that most fan-made content gets made. You find a cool picture online, and you put it on a card. Um, and in most cases, it wasn't really possible to get approval for doing this because the artists themselves often doesn't have the rights to work they produce. It's commissioned work. Someone else holds the
Mm-hmm.
rights. Or it is IP-based work, like if it's a picture of, uh, Glorfindel, that's based on the Tolkien IP, and we wouldn't have the permission to use that, even if the artist said, like, go ahead, uh, because it is not we don't own the IP. Same with the FFG game itself. We don't have the IP for the FFG game. We don't have the intellectual property of the all the graphic design on the cards. We don't own any of this. And so we always took the approach that everything we make will be free. It will be given away completely for free. We won't take any money. We won't take donations. We won't take anything. In the same way that people make fan-made cards and post them online for free. Um, because at least here in the U.S., there's this something called fair use, the fair use doctrine. Certain requirements can follow that can build a case for you using protected intellectual property in a permissive way. So we are allowed to use Tolkien's IP. We're allowed to use FFGs and artists' IP because we're doing it for free. We don't stand to gain any money. We're not taking
Yep.
any money away from anyone. Um, and the work is transformative. There's many aspects to the fair use doctrine, but we believe our use is fair. Um, and so we were happy to, um, we were satisfied with what we were doing for cycle one in this way. And then by the end of cycle one, these AI art creators, these content, these AI art generators really took off. They got a
Yeah.
lot better just in a couple of years. And there's a lot of ethical concerns with those as well. It's using, being trained on artists' work without permission, and is being used to generate money in many cases. And for the same way we felt about all the IP we were using for cycle one, we felt we could ethically use these AI art generators for cycle two, because we're not making any money. We're not taking money away from artists in doing this. Um, this is purely a voluntary effort, and we feel it still falls under fair use. And so, because of that, we decided to adopt the AI art generators because they were just more flexible in producing the type of art that matched the card and in the consistent style so that all the cards could have the same style of artwork. And we understand that maybe not everyone sees eye to eye with us. No, not everyone agrees with us on this. That's fine. We don't expect everyone to. If you still don't like our use of the AI art and you want to avoid ALEP for that reason, that's totally in your power to do so. It doesn't hurt us financially, so we don't mind if people avoid our products. We're just putting them out there for free. If you like it, if you're okay with it, then you can get printed. If not, that's okay. But I will say, overall, I think ALEP is a net positive for artists because we do commit, despite taking in no money, we do commission art, and we pay artists for many of the heroes. Most of the heroes are commission pieces, as well as several of the player cards. I get the money to do this through a separate project called Farcom, Farcom. It's on Patreon, and this is where people help me to just commission Lord of the Rings artwork, totally separate from ALEP. If you just want to get a full resolution picture of some character in Tolkien's world, you can support this project, and I will commission a piece and share the full resolution file with you. And so I've got a bunch of people helping me commission art for that separate project, which then I myself bring over to ALEP and use for many of those cards there. And I wouldn't have ever started that project without ALEP, and because that's the main area I use that art. And without ALEP, I might even stop commissioning. I don't know. So you can make the case that overall ALEP is a net force for good for artists. I certainly feel that way. But again, people are free to disagree.
Yes, indeed. All right. Thank you very much, Seastan, for all these very interesting opinions and discussion. If some people want to support the ALEP initiative, how can they help with the effort?
Well, they can join ALEP if they want to do playtesting or help with editing or writing articles for our blog or helping improve design of cards, designing quests. There's so much that goes on. The actual design of cards is maybe like 5% of what the hours spent on ALEP is. So, there's really a job for everyone. Or if you want to help commission artwork, you can, like I said, go to my Farcom Patreon and help commission artwork, which will then eventually show up in the game.
So we'll leave the useful links in the description of the video. So for those of you who are interested in supporting the effort, you'll find these just below the video. Thank you very much, Seastan, for the discussion.
Oh, thank you for having me. This has been great. And I've just really enjoyed talking about ALEP and card design with you. I think we should do this again.
Yeah, and hopefully we will hear about ALEP content soon with the next releases. Thank you very much, Seastan.
Bye-bye.
See you soon.